Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Winkler again. Glad you came back for a little bit more. This is the fourth lecture in the Ancient Civilization class. And I need to start out with an apology. I told you earlier when I was introducing things like in the first lecture that there are going to be times when I'm going to think one thing and say another. I happen to review my lecture from last time and I go, oh, okay. Last time I gave you kind of a list of the 5 most important civilizations we tend to associate with Mesopotamia. One of them I told you was the Akkadians. That's incorrect. I should have said Assyrians. I was thinking one thing and said another. There's even something even more embarrassing. When I was telling you about the development of cuneiform, and I looked at the word syllable, I'd written it down in the study guide. It is right where it's supposed to be. It's right here, and it says syllables. And I looked at that, and suddenly I'm thinking vowels. Well, syllables and vowels aren't even close. What I was telling you about vowels is probably much more appropriate when we're discussing Phoenician and Hebrew writing later. So once again, small mistakes. I do apologize if that's ever confusing. Hopefully I will be careful and I will make the least number of mistakes possible. In any event, we were talking about the first epic literature, which is called the Gilgamesh. I told you last time, it's very important for us to realize that it was very popular. This is not something that somebody wrote and threw in a closet and forgot about. One of the reasons why we think it was so popular is that so many copies have existed. Not complete copies, but fragments in various places over a lengthy period of time. This would believe that it has staying power. Whatever is saying there resonates with the people. As I was trying to explain last time, certain mores in society we want to read about. For example, we don't see a lot of novels in modern society, do we? About panhandlers and derelicts and people sleep at park benches and spend nights in flop houses. Those books do exist, but don't we want to hear a little bit more about the charming, good-looking lawyer working his way up through the corporation, meeting challenges and overcoming them? Don't we want to see that? Of course we do. So to a certain extent, it should reflect our society, but also to a certain extent, literature does have a tendency to think in terms of our aspirations. Now, Gilgamesh, the character himself within this epic literature, is a king. Well, we're going to read a lot more books in modern society about upper class people than are lower class people. So this fits relatively well, doesn't it? Well, I have a statement here that it tends to be pessimistic. I'll try to explain that as I go along. Why would people, however, so we get another map of Mesopotamia up here, why would people be relatively pessimistic in this society? There can always be troubles with early death and what you and I would call bad hygiene, which a lot of people don't realize what's going on. Diseases strike, no one knows the cause for them. This happens in all societies. But there's actually other reasons why we have a tendency to look at this and think, well, there are some problems. We'll talk about Egypt in a little while. The Egypt floods regularly, almost always, relatively benignly. Kind of goes up easily, covers the area, a nice good silt. When the water level goes down, it also does that relatively benignly. It doesn't really destroy much of anything. Now you can have terrific floods, however, in Mesopotamia. These are mountains, a high country up here. It depends a lot on the amount of snowfall you have. It also depends a lot on how warm it gets in the spring. But if you have an awful lot of snowfall up here, and it packs in, and then you have a spring that is very warm, or summer for that matter, that's very warm, you can have an awful lot of water coming out of here at any given time. You can have floods. Remember when earlier I was talking about Shamash Napishtim? Someone who apparently had survived a flood. People relate to this. Archaeologists have gone to Mesopotamia. They have dug down and found floodplains, mud that was laid down by floods, and sometimes it's several feet thick. And sometimes when you dig through the mud and get the artifacts on the other side, there's actually more artifacts down low than there is on top of the mud. In other words, the loss of cities, towns, villages could be quite catastrophic because of the nature of these floods. We have reason to believe this is a problem. When you have that kind of thing happening, it's easy to fear. Now, later we'll be talking about Egypt, and I'll talk about it is hard to invade Egypt. It really doesn't happen very often. But remember, in talking about the 5 major civilizations in Mesopotamia, we have problems with invasion. So we think we have more warfare, we have more floods, and a lot of other problems. Can we therefore argue that the mentality of these people might be pessimistic? Might be arguing that, well, son of a gun, it's so bad, bad things happen, and is it easy to relate to a happy, good story where everything works out well, when society, as you look around yourself, is quite challenged? So there is a tenor here that's pessimistic. Well, essentially the story is this. Gilgamesh is the man. He's the dude, big, tall, strong. He's vain. The gods don't like this. You're stuck on yourself, kind of thing. So they create Enkidu. He's kind of half man, half beast. Do you have a good example of Enkidu? Probably. Okay. I think we're talking about anime. Enkidu is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He's considered to be half man, half beast. Sometimes you see him depicted as a man's body, perhaps something like this, with an animal head or an animal shoulders and head. Not terribly surprising. Sometimes he is depicted a little bit more bestial. The one I was trying to show you is not easy to find. I'll try it one more time, and as I'm very good at doing, I will give up. Yeah, looking something like this perhaps. Part man, part beast. Well, he's also very big. The gods create him to teach Gilgamesh a lesson. My goodness, this guy's going to come in here and he's going to take Gilgamesh down. The crime of Gilgamesh is largely vanity. Enkidu, well, isn't that what happens to a lot of people in a pessimistic view of the world? When you build yourself up, you get torn down because conditions are so challenging. Any event, they have contests. Yeah, it's like WWF. These really big guys, and they're knocking down buildings. And this is a pretty tough match. You grab each other, whatever the moves were. You throw them down, and you jump on them. I'm not going to say that this is perhaps the best way to win friends and influence people. That you fight it out with somebody, and if you both don't win, as I say, you both win, you tie essentially, then you make good friends. Oh, you're a pretty good guy anyway. Let's enjoy ourselves. But this is what happens according to the story. They respect each other. They go on adventures. Now remember, the gods aren't terribly happy with what's gone on here. Wait a minute, this isn't what should happen. Enkidu was supposed to teach Gilgamesh a lesson. He wasn't supposed to be a friend to Gilgamesh. So they take him down, they kill him. Now, Gilgamesh is devastated by this. His close friend, his confidant, his buddy. We went on all these adventures together. Now he's gone. So Gilgamesh tries to find him. Life after death. What's happened to him? And this is where we have some of these other stories, like the Sumerian Noah, where in his travels Gilgamesh meets these various people. But can we say that Enkidu is lost to the underworld? Usually when you and I think of heaven and the infernal regions, heaven has a tendency to be in the sky. Remember, that's where Marduk lives. That's where Ra is, these important gods at this time frame. But the netherworld is not such a nice place. It's essentially into the ground. Even in modern society, you and I, in our modern belief systems, would tend to believe that heaven is up there and the infernal regions are down here. So essentially, Enkidu is lost in the underworld. If you want a happy ending, Gilgamesh would find Enkidu and bring him back up, I guess, bring him back to life. This really isn't what happens. But as we talk about great literature, this is probably our first example. Okay, let's talk about Hammurabi. Hammurabi is Babylonian. I should actually say Neo-Babylonian, the New Babylonian Age. And going back to our nice little map here, that's Gilgamesh. Actually, one of the more complete versions we have of Gilgamesh was etched onto a stone. I have not seen the original. In fact, I don't know where it is. But the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. and the Museum of Natural History has a full-scale reproduction of this. So you get a pretty good idea. That is what we see. Now this, of course, would be Gilgamesh. And I'm not sure what he's doing with the lion, but it looks like the lion's in kind of trouble. With one arm, this guy's controlling a lion. Obviously, he's not a normal person. He's big, and by goodness, this guy is tough. All right. So we have Hammurabi. Hammurabi is a conqueror among the conquerors. And he takes over the Mesopotamia, and he sets up a law code. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've had a few friends who are lawyers, and they will tell me, if you really want to understand a human community or human society, you have to understand their laws. I'm sure there's a lot to that. So what you do is what Hammurabi does, and this is just the top of the stele. The actual text, which I'd like to show you, it's a little hard to do, is below. You can see that the actual text is below this. This is pretty hard stone. It's probably granite. It's going to be very, very hard to etch anything in there. But they do, and this is the law code. When these were first found in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, they found a couple of three of them in various places, like on the corners of where Hammurabi's would have lived. Hammurabi's empire would have been. So you can see this at various places, and you can see this as you come and you go. This is not something that you write up and put in an archive, have a bunch of clay tablets and throw them in a drawer. No, this is someplace it's supposed to be seen. Of course, you have to be very well educated to read this, but the text is easy to find. So what is the function of the law code? Here are some direct quotes from the law code. Why is it there? In the preamble to our Constitution, we have a statement as to purpose. Domestic, in short, for the common defense, these statements which we see very early in the Constitution. We also see this very early in Hammurabi's code. Rule of righteousness, okay, we're here to do good things. We're here to destroy the wicked. If you're a lawbreaker, we're going to take you down. So that the strong should not harm the weak. And that's very interesting. A lot of times in a law code, we have law to protect people from other people. It's very, very common. It's a key function in many respects. If you are like Gilgamesh, you're big, strong people, and you can hold a lion under one arm, your justice is, shall we say, in that arm. Your justice in your strength. Your justice in your weapons. Your justice in the number of men you can hire to do your bidding for you. But see, law codes go beyond that. You don't want to have justice, the guy with the biggest club, when you're fighting it out in a city park. What you want to have is something beyond that really does justice, to make sure you don't have to carry the biggest baseball bat, to make sure you don't have to have the biggest gun to be protected, because the social, the political, the legal system will protect you, so that the strong should not harm the weak. Now, in our belief system, our legal codes, we do have a tendency to think that that all people by the same social status would benefit equally. We don't really have a nobility in the United States. We do have social status largely by wealth, not necessarily by birth. You can't be born into wealth, obviously, but largely if you have wealth, even if you attain it later in life, you have status and you have power in society. In reality, is there times when the wealthy do actually benefit a little bit better from the legal system? That's probably true in the United States. But it's very true in the time frame of there I go again, time frame of Hammurabi. Different for social status. And the next thing I have up here, as you can see, punishment fit the crimes. For example, there's a statement in the book of Exodus, when it gets to the laws of the Hebrews, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, that's not the first time that this is put into a law code, because very similar things are said also in the Code of Hammurabi. If you do something to another person, you break the law, you commit a crime. I guess you get in a barroom brawl and pop somebody, and you hit that person, and you knock out a tooth. Therefore, it should be required of you to lose a tooth as well. I call this rough justice. In our system, justice works differently. If you do something wrong, cause somebody to lose a tooth, very rarely they're going to knock your tooth out. You might go to jail, you might be incarcerated, you might be fined, you might be forced to pay another person for the kind of crime you've committed. I call that more advanced justice, but an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, I call rough justice. But it's different by social status. Let's say I'm a low-class person and I'm involved in this barroom brawl. I throw one too many punches, somebody loses a tooth, and that person, however, I'm fighting, is of the same social status as I am. Then I lose a tooth. What if that person is a different social status, however? Let's say that person is upper class, and I deck that person loses a tooth. I'm in big trouble, because I might lose all the teeth in my mouth because I hurt somebody of a different social status. There's a lot of rules and regulations deal with, shall we say, nocturnal activities. I've already mentioned the guys at the bar. You have a few too many beers, you have problems. Yeah. So you're going to find more stipulations on that kind of thing. They have to be very, very careful about witnesses. You see, it's very easy for a witness to perjure him or herself when that person is giving testimony in a law code. Very often, the judges and lawyers in the United States says, everybody's lying. Well, hopefully that's not true. But if a large percentage of people are lying, how do you tell if one person is telling the truth or another one person is telling the truth? They might be different accounts. What the Hammurabi's Code does is you want to have more than one person. A deposition, an accusation made by one person is not valid. you have to have accusation, usually by two. So you have two people. Can we say disinterested? In other words, they're not brother and sister or father and son. This guy lives over here, this guy lives over here, who saw this event, and they would give similar testimony. Does that overweigh the one guy over here? It probably should. If they catch you giving false testimony, however, this is a severe crime. It's not just a fine. They're going to do some pretty bad damage to you. They have a different concept of culpability. Let's say you build a wall. I'm a brick mason, contract, and they say, build a wall for us. Build a wall right there. I get out there with my mud brick, I put it all together. Then, let's say a few months later, something happens. The wall falls down, and it kills somebody. Very, very dangerous kind of thing. It was hard to call it murder, but I become guilty of killing another person, even if it's unintentional. And I can be severely punished for that. In some systems, you can have some punishment, because if you do bad work and someone gets hurt because of that bad work. We say this is more stark than what you and I are used to. Since this law code is very old, some people say, I have read this, that all other law codes, particularly in the Middle East and the Western tradition, actually go back to this one. One of the ways we could make that argument is the Bible is very important in the Middle East, also in virtually all Western law codes after the fall of Rome, or after Rome became Christianized. And if Hammurabi's law code says certain things and goes into the Bible, you can see how it could influence laws at other places at later times. Well, having said this, I want to say something in defense of the Bible. Yes, it does say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I'm not denying that, but I am saying that when you read the Bible, the other laws, and I'll make a bigger deal about this when we do discuss the ancient Hebrews, but what we're seeing is something not as stark as what I call rough justice. We're seeing something that I'm going to say is on a higher moral plane. Let's shift over a little bit and start talking about another extremely important ancient civilization in the Middle East. This is Egypt. Ancient Egypt, we need a few images here. We'd like to get a map. While I do find Mesopotamia to be very interesting, to a certain extent, ancient Egypt has a little more glitz and glitter, because you really don't have the same kind of problem. You really have a lot of stone. Not mud brick like we have in Mesopotamia. Because we have stone, we have monumental architecture that can be stunningly beautiful. And it's also extremely durable, being made out of stone. I don't know if I really have to spend a lot of time discussing this, because I'm sure you've had this kind of treatment before. I've had this, it's kind of fun. What we have, sometimes we call Egypt the gift of the Nile. The Nile River comes out of Nubia, and it comes down here. And as already mentioned, benignly floods, usually late in the summer into the fall. And it goes up relatively benignly. One of the reasons for this is the slope is not extensive. When you have floods coming out of the mountains, which are near Mesopotamia, they can come out in torrents. You have a river valley, it benignly floods. I've not been to Egypt, I'd like to go. I've been told that there are places where you can actually put your foot in the Sahara Desert and put your other foot on the floodplain of Egypt, because the boundary between them is not subject to nearly as much fluctuation. When you say down the Nile, that means down the flow of the Nile. So this is Lower Egypt down here. To me, that's always odd, because to me, up is north and down is south. But in this case, up is south, Upper Egypt's down here, and Lower Egypt is north, down this direction. The delta is extremely important, but the delta is a slightly different scenario. The Nile comes down here and it goes into various channels. Yes, you have benign flooding, but the contrast between the Nile Valley and the desert, which is right next to it, is not nearly as profound here, because you have such a large and important floodplain. I'm going to give you some dates. I like to give dates. I don't test on dates. I hope I made that clear by now. I don't test on dates. I give you dates for your reference. You see, it's very helpful if you have a concept of chronology. That which comes after something can influence that which comes before. But I do not test you on dates. I will never ask you for a date. I might say, well, what happened in the 3rd millennium BC? I'm not going to ask you what happened on Thursday the 14th on a certain date. I'm not going to do that. I'm just giving you dates for your reference. One of the things I would like to say when we're talking about this is that depending on which reference books you use, which textbooks you use, which books you have read, sometimes these dates vary. So I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm trying to give you numbers that are essentially ballpark. Very important, benign flooding. Egypt is a gift to the Nile. Okay, going back to, depending which source you want to read, Egypt starts about 3110 BC. That's when archaeologists go down and they say, well, this is when we can identify that there are people living in towns. The cities which we see, like in Mesopotamia, are not quite as pronounced in Egypt, for the simple reason that we're talking about relatively narrow confines, and it's easier to build down along the river than it is to have a nice city. Let me say something else before I get off the topic. Egypt is relatively hard to invade. Remember, we have changes in civilizations fairly rapidly in Mesopotamia. But Egypt's harder to invade. Now, you can come down the Nile from Nubia in this direction. The Nubians aren't really as advanced, shall we say, militarily and technologically. So the threat is not terribly strong from them. In fact, as we read about the Egyptians and their military expeditions, a lot of times they're going up the Nile. It's very, very difficult to invade either from the east or the west. The Red Sea is probably the most brackish, or the highest salt content of any sea in the world. It doesn't have a lot of streams flowing into it. It's one of the problems. So even if you took a fleet over here, you're going to have a hard time maintaining yourself. Not much water. Then you land on the coast, and there's not much fodder for your animals. And then you're going to march across a pretty severe desert before you get over to Egypt. We don't have any successful invasions from this direction. Can we say it's even more challenging? You go on the west of the Nile over in this direction. Oh, there's a few oases out here, but not enough to support a large civilization by any means. And there's not enough water and routes here to support large armies. This is one of the more severe deserts literally in the world. So marching across here, that's not going to happen either. Do you see? From the south, from the west and the east, you're not going to invade this place. There are a few examples of successful invasions up in the Delta area. We'll mention them as we go along. But if you can defend this, and the Egypts, they're going to have to defend this on several occasions, you're going to be able to develop your civilization without nearly as much fear of enemy invasion. You'll be able to develop your civilization largely on its own, without a lot of other influences. Well, let's talk a little about some of the broad time frames here. The proto-dynastic period. Egypt is so very, very old. We have a tendency to break it down by dynasties. Do you know what a dynasty is? A dynasty is essentially a family. Now remember, this is a society that largely passes on power from father to son. So if you have your daddy, we call them pharaohs, a daddy pharaoh, and he has sonny boy pharaoh and grandson pharaoh, it's the same dynasty. What happens if you hit a dead end? You hit a child that either doesn't have any male children or has no children at all. Maybe you're sterile for whatever reason. Then that dynasty comes to an end. Authority, power, the pharaoh, the office of pharaoh can go to other people at the same time. So we break them down as dynasties. And when one disappears, another one reappears over here. In studies I read in the Middle Ages, we also talk about some dynasties ruling in various places during the Middle Ages. And we argued that perhaps on the average, every century, about 25% of these royal lines will die out. If you're having 25% die out in a century, in several centuries, probably everybody's going to be gone. And when you have a civilization like Egypt that lasts several thousand years, you do see there's going to be a shift in dynasties. Before the dynastic period, people are ruling, people are in control. But then we get to broader categories than even dynasties. The Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, remember, these dates are not locked. You'll see other dates, other places. Probably, I'm not sure I did you a really good service here. Maybe I should have rounded these off. Maybe a round number would be a little bit less confusing than specific dates. There is a problem, as we understand dates in ancient Egypt. You and I all know that our year is 365 days. Technically speaking, it's 365 and a quarter days. For whatever reason, I don't know why the Egyptians made this mistake, but very often their year is 360 days. Well, being off by 5 days isn't terribly challenging, but over a few decades or a few centuries, that can throw off your numbering system. So when we're trying to impose our numbering system on them, sometimes it does not work perfectly. Well, okay, please excuse me. The dates are fairly precise. The Old Kingdom has some of the more brilliant aspects of Egyptian architecture. This is when the Great Pyramids were constructed. We'll talk about them in a little while. This is a time frame when you have these monumental architecture. One of our problems in understanding how the pyramids were constructed is they were constructed so early that we don't have adequate records to help us. So I will come back and discuss that later. We have a period we call the First Intermediate. Can you see here? The First Intermediate's roughly 100 years. What happened? What happened to break down order in the ancient world, in society? Can we say disorder is often caused by external invasion? That's not the case in this. That's not the situation in this case. Often, however, you can have problems if the food supply runs low. I remember reading a commentary once about the social situation in a lot of places. Some people say that every society is between 2 and 3 meals away from revolution. Okay, you go without breakfast. I don't recommend it. I understand it's pretty good for you to eat breakfast. But you go without breakfast and your tummy's hurting you. What happens if you go without breakfast that much? Then you have a bigger problem. Can we say that by dinner, particularly if you don't know where their next meal is coming from, you might be down at the city county building with your baseball bats and rocks saying, smashing the pavement saying, feed me. Maybe that's a clearly exaggeration. But on the other hand, you find a lot more problems with social order when there is going to be hunger. What we understand is this. There was a major drought in Egypt. Well, how do you have a drought in a desert where you get very little rainfall anyway? The Nile did not flood. Let me repeat that. It comes every year. Now it doesn't flood. I'm sure you know that the origin of the Nile is way down in Central Africa. I'm not sure any people that have studied, that have studied the history of Egypt, climatologists, whatever. I'm not aware that they've I'll say that right yet, have ever been able to adequately explain what happened. But the Blue Nile, White Nile simply don't flood anymore. And the amount of water they're sending down is a lot less than what you expect. What happened in Central Africa? I do not know. How do we know this kind of thing happened? Let's go back to my map. It's kind of a fun map. It doesn't give me everything I would like to tell you, however. You see, when the Nile floods, and there's the floodplain here, there's actually a lake that is often formed off to the side. I'm not sure I can find that for you. Yeah, here we go. Here we have an example of a lake. Now, looking at archaeological evidence, in other words, where the people lived near the lake over time, you do get an idea of the fluctuation of this. And as you take sediment samples, what the archaeologists can do in this case is you send a drill. And the drill goes down, we call it a core, goes down considerable distance into the mud or whatever beneath the bottom of the lake. And pulling up these cores and examining them, archaeologists have been able to show that there's a time, about this time, when there is no mud in the lake. The chemical composition of the soil, whatever is down there, is that which is not laid down underwater. Earlier it is, or later it is, but not at that point. We can extrapolate that the Nile is clearly not flooding. It has been also argued that maybe at certain times it actually quit flowing. Maybe you have a few mud flats there, but it's not flowing anymore. You could imagine the literal disaster that this would cause. Near anarchy? Yeah, when it gets that bad, you get a bunch of guys together and say, we're going to find food someplace. And maybe there's food down around the bend of the riverbed or something like that. Let's go down and beat somebody up and see if we can get something to eat. Near anarchy. Remember, the pyramids were constructed before, shall we say, in the Old Kingdom. And of course, these are elaborate and brilliant. We have reason to believe the treasures in there were stunning. Gold and precious jewels. But upon examining them, all that was gone a long time ago. We believe this is when the pyramids were plundered. When people went in and grabbed what they could and took it and sold it wherever they could get some food. Well, fortunately for Egyptian history, we actually have the Nile does start to flow again. The lake does fill up with water. The annual inundation of the river starts over again, and now you can feed your people. It takes a little while. You get conquerors, upper Nile, lower Nile, slugging it out, but finally you do get order back again. And now you have the civilization, which can progress. Middle Kingdom, I remember I took some weird classes in college. This is graduate school, Art of Ancient Egypt. And what I really remember about the Middle Kingdom in art is that the figures had one foot kind of extended in front of the other one. Well, okay, we have a Middle Kingdom. It is important. It does reestablish order. But pyramid building has actually gone downhill. Then we get to what we call the Second Intermediate. The Second Intermediate has something that really hasn't happened before in Egyptian history. Remember, we have a civil war during the First Intermediate, people slugging it out. In the Second Intermediate, we have an external invasion that is successful. The external invasion, people coming in here, probably when they brought in chariots, usually almost always, when you have two civilizations meet. The civilization with higher technology tends to be victorious over the civilization with, shall we say, weaker technology. In this case, military technology. So I have an external invasion by the Hyksos, who come in and control the area for a few hundred years. This is a time frame where we do believe that Joseph, remember Joseph? Remember there's 12 brothers. Daddy's name is Israel. He has 12 sons. You know the story. The brothers decide they're going to act like they're going to kill this kid. But why kill him? You can simply take him and sell him into Egypt. And slaves are worth money. And so he gets shipped down there. And you're familiar with the story about how he worked up and became, shall we say, Pharaoh's right-hand man. Because there's a drought at this time frame, the Hebrews go back to the brothers, go back to Israel, and you bring in the tribes and their families. And they're in the land of Goshen. Is that on this map? Goshen's up in this area, the land of Goshen. And when you're up in the land of Goshen, then unfortunately for the Hebrews, they extend in numbers to the point where people are nervous about them. The way the Bible talks about the transition from the Hebrews being welcomed into Egypt to being enslaved in Egypt, it says essentially this: and there grew up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. That's very short to say that the people, the Hyksos, even though they're there for a long time, were still considered to be foreigners. And finally, the local Egyptians rose up against them. And the Hebrews, according to the scenario, I think it's likely, according to the scenario, that the Hebrews were kind of looked down upon because they were associated with the Hyksos. And that made them easier to be viewed as enemies and to enslave them. So the area now is the New Kingdom. Architecture stunning. The pyramids are not built this time frame, but there are stunning levels of architecture. Can we say most of the people, 2/3, 3/4 of the people that we hear of in Egypt come from the New Kingdom. And when we look at the architecture that was left over after the end of Egypt, the heavy majority of this, 3/4, something like that, are people, not people, are buildings, structures, temples that were made during the New Kingdom. Was this the time frame of Moses and the Exodus, where Moses came to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go that they may worship me in the wilderness," and they left. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about the Hebrews again a little bit later. But something I just wanted to show you, which I think is fairly amusing. At least it's amusing to me. We hear about Joseph. Sometimes we forget to keep progressing or reading the story. We read about Joseph being sold into Egypt and how he was accused falsely by Potiphar's wife, and he goes into prison. Since this man can tell you what dreams mean, he starts to work up. He's such a cool guy. He ends up being the right-hand man of Pharaoh. We kind of remember that. We remember the Hebrews come in. But the story is longer than that. Remember, there was a drought. 7 years of good years. Remember, 7 is a pretty important number. 7 years of drought. I said that wrong. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, of drought. Now, the right-hand man is Joseph, and he's overseeing what happens. And as the drought continues and the famine continues, the people come to Joseph and say, we got to eat. And Joseph says, well, buy the food. He says, what with? Well, we'll give you the land. Okay, so now you've taken the land and given over to Pharaoh. They're still hungry. Joseph says, what do you have? We've got our cattle, we've got our sheep. Okay, sign them over to me. Now, we'll give them back to you. You can still use them, but they're owned by Pharaoh. Same thing about the land. You can still use the land. You can still farm them, but it's owned by Pharaoh. Finally, when the drought gets bad enough, people come and say, we need food. And Joseph says, well, what you got left? He says, remember one of the theories as to how slavery becomes a relatively common, shall we say, form of social control and labor control is because you're poor and you have no choice but to sell yourself into slavery in order to survive. So we will be the king's slaves. And Joseph made, let's go back, Joseph made slaves of the people from one end of Egypt to another. I'm not sure if we can say in a number of just a few years that the state of people in Egypt went from a state of slavery, freedom to a state of slavery. But can we say that this kind of process, even though it probably didn't take place in a brief period of time, that over a lengthy period of time, this is the kind of way that in the New Kingdom, at least, maybe going back earlier as well, that you can start to lose your freedom. Because when you have nothing, you need something, you have nothing to sell but yourself, you end up in a condition of slavery. Late period, yeah. Now, late period, you usually end about the time with the invasion of the Persians. We'll talk about them in other contexts later on. Well, one of the things we remember mostly about ancient Egypt is the burials. Well, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about ancient Egypt? You think about the pyramids. Well, that's burials, right? How do you bury people? Can I show you a circle grave here? Circle grave, fire pit. Well, that's not exactly what I wanted to look at. Circle grave, how about Egypt? Well, how about ancient Egypt? They tend to bury people, I don't know why, for cultural reasons, in circles. Now, it's very easy to bury somebody. If you bury somebody in the Nile Delta and it floods, pretty soon the water gets on the corpse and the corpse dissipates, it rots away. But all you have to do, in most places, very easy to do, you simply walk outside of the Nile floodplain, and you're out in these warm, so I say hot sands, hot and very dry sands. And you take mama or daddy or grandpa and grandma and you put them out there and you bury them. Okay, not uncommon. But as you know, when the wind blows in the Sahara and there can be a shift, if you will, wind blows in the desert, you can have a shift of sand. And there's a natural form of mummification that takes place at this time. It still does now, I'm sure. You simply get there, and as the warm, dry sand tends to draw the moisture out of the body. So when you do that, let me get your body here. When you do that, the body does not rot or deteriorate in the same manner as if you had it out, either laying out in the open area or someplace where water can get to it. It's important to realize that this kind of thing is happening, because when it does, and people see the corpses, they say, isn't it a pretty good idea if we can figure out a way to make the corpses look the same? When we talk about mummification, I will mention that process a little bit later. Well, if you're wealthy, you don't need to take out and grab grandma and throw her in a sand dune. How about a structure? And in doing so, we start having mastabas. Mastaba in Egypt. These are very old. They tend to be very old. Well, this is a pyramid. It's a mastaba on top of a mastaba. Let's take a look at this. Essentially what we're looking at right here is a structure above ground. And it's not uncommon, very common actually, to take a person down here, take the corpse, take dad down there, and you dig down and you dig out a little tomb, a crypt down there, and that's where you deposit the body. Now, that's pretty nice. I consider that to be a pretty advanced structure. But you're rich. Why don't you just, let's build it up. Notice you have the idea of a mastaba here, but you're building it up to another step. All you have to do is build up step after step, going up, shall we say, as far as structures are concerned, I already mentioned this, that pyramids do have a tendency to be among the most stable of all large buildings you can have. If it's like this, not as stable. It's like this, it is stable. This is the famous step pyramid, which is not quite exactly a pyramid. If we meet a pyramid by having smooth sides, this doesn't quite do this. But all you have to do is have the mastaba on top of mastaba, and then externally you put a smooth side on it, and now you have a pyramid. So there is a fairly logical progression for those who are wealthy. Of course, there's no wealthier person in all of Egypt than the pharaoh. So he's going to want to have himself a pretty nice place for his spirit and his body to reside until they come together and in another afterlife. One of the more interesting builders is Seneferu. And we have the Great Pyramid of Meidum. This is a curious structure. Doesn't really look like a pyramid, does it? Can we get a larger shot there? Doesn't really look like a pyramid. What we have around here is, well, what is that? Some people say that's rubble. Apparently, and I saw it here, and I probably should have pulled it up before I grabbed this. What we have here is a building that was probably built and then collapsed. Let's go back and see if I can give you a better representation here. Thought I saw it earlier. I'll try it one more time. Okay. Not much. I guess this works for our purposes. The idea was to have, and you can see we have steps going up here, and then the final outer casing came up like this. Archaeologists have spent some time looking around in this. It looks like rubble. What looks like happened is it was being built up, and then for whatever reason the entire structure became unsound and it collapsed. It has been, some archaeologists said they have found evidence of human remains within this structure. In other words, people were working on this, and it collapsed very unexpectedly and very rapidly before the people could get off it. So people died in this. See, this is not terribly, shall we say, advanced building when you have your things fall down around you. So we believe it collapsed. No, corpse was buried inside of it. It just fell down. Now, about the same time, probably exactly the same time perhaps, Senefru was building another pyramid. And we call it the Bent Pyramid. I'd like to give you a long shot at it. Notice it comes up at an angle, and then the angle becomes more shallow. If you're building this up, and obviously you can take this, if you took that straight up, the building would be higher. But as you do this, it becomes lower. Now, there's more than one possibility as to why they decided to do this. One of which could easily be that they decided, well, you know, the king's old and he's kind of getting decrepit, and he wants this done before he dies, and so using less material means you can build it faster. Another theory is that they were building more pyramid at one time. And when the pyramid of Meidum collapsed, the architects are going back and look at this one saying, we can't risk that again. Maybe we need a flatter angle and not as steep an angle. But the bent pyramid stands. I have seen some photographs. They're taken very close up, exactly the bend. And I'm probably not going to find one easily here. Can we say, therefore, there's an evolution of pyramid construction where they're learning how to do things? Now, the Great Pyramid. 4th dynasty. It's what, 61 dynasties in ancient Egypt. The 4th is very early. The Great Pyramid, let's look at the Great Pyramids. Okay, let's see if I can get the right place. The Great Pyramid. There is a group of pyramids. It's kind of fun to play a game. Sometimes, I guess I'm a sadistic old man. I don't really expect students to understand this, but it's interesting as we look at the angles of various photographs here, that depending on the angle of the photograph, it's hard to tell which is the tallest building. Of the, we usually talk about 3. Is that a good shot? You see there's smaller ones here. Of the 3, we often put this one closest. At least that's what the photographs are taken. It is not the tallest. It is the shortest of the 3. The tallest is actually this one back here. Now, the top is no longer extant. It doesn't quite go up to the point as it did in ancient times. But we do say that it was 481 feet high. Whoa! That's absolutely huge. That's going to be the tallest building anywhere in the world until in the Middle Ages. I think it's the Cathedral of Ulm in Germany, where all they have is a tower going up to a higher level. So being very, very old, it's extreme amount of work involved in this. How long did it take to build it? What was the nature of the construction? We'll talk about Herodotus later when we talk about ancient Greek historians. He's often considered to be the father of history, one of the more important characters. One of the things fascinating about him is he's kind of a tourist. I'll talk about this later. He's trying to find out about the Persian Wars when the Greeks were fighting the Persians. He goes to anywhere he can find out information on the Persian Wars, even talking to people in the Middle East. Of course, a tourist in the Middle East, where do you want to go? I mean, you want to go to Egypt. This is a tourist site for thousands of years. Rome later on. If you're in Rome and we talk about Rome's magnificent architecture, it is stunning, it is brilliant, it is beautiful. Where do they go on vacation? Well, they go down to Egypt because what is in Egypt is even more impressive. It's really quite stunning. Anyway, Herodotus comes down here, and he talks to the tour guide. I'm not going to say the tour guides are always the most accurate people. A lot of times tour guides will tell you things like that they think you want to hear, or they will distort the actual record. One time when I was in New York City, the tour guide told us, I should say, that the Republican National Convention for 1860, when Abraham Lincoln got the nomination, was held in New York City. And I'm going, could be a wise guy. The Republican National Convention was in Chicago, was not in New York City. I mean, come on. In any event, they're not necessarily the most accurate people. But this is what Herodotus was told. It took 10 years to make the base and 20 years to make the structure itself. The base, sandstone, laid out. If you've got a good base, you have a lot better chance of having a good structure that'll hold up. What you want is a base that is completely flat. How do you do this? We are actually in Copper Age technology. Iron Age is not going to come for a couple thousand years. I'm exaggerating, almost a couple thousand years. So how do you level things down? Well, you get harder stone like granite, and you have not sandstone, you have limestone, and you get hundreds, thousands of people out there leveling it. How on earth do you make sure it is completely level? Well, you just get a bunch of guys out there with big jugs of water, dump the water all over, and you look at that and you see, well, where are the pools? When you see where the pools are, you notice that is a different level than where there are not. I shouldn't call them pools. Puddles is a better word. We see the water is here and it's not here. So this is higher than that. Over a lengthy period of time of very careful calculations. The base of this, and of course with modern technology, we can actually take a good look at this, and we find out that kitty corner from here to here, going across, should say from here to here, the variation is about 1 inch. That's stunning for what they were doing. So the base is very good, which means the structure itself has a much better chance of being stable. Now, depending which estimates you want to read, that I've read that there was 2.3 million stones involved in the Great Pyramid. Some of the other estimates like 2.8. I'm not here to say that we can count because we can't, but can we say 2.3, 2.8, maybe a good average on our estimates about 2.5 million stones. 2.5 million stones. The average weight of the stone is over 2 tons. How on earth are you going to carve these out without iron tools? It's again a block of granite. No draft animals. There's no donkey, there's no horse, there's no camel. The only way you can move these things is by grunt human force. How on earth are you going to do that? The quarries, can I get back to my map here? Got too many pyramids. I need a map of Egypt. That's not helpful. Wow, how about way down here? I'm back in the Gilgamesh. All right, here we go. The pyramids are built down here. The quarries, where they got a lot of the stone, is actually up here on the other side of the Nile. The only way you can get a slab of stone down here is from here and put it on a boat. Now you got something that weighs over two tons. That's on the average. There's going to be other stones that are going to weigh a lot more than 2 tons. Now you've got boats, and of course we know a lot about their boats. Some of the boats were actually placed in tombs. We have tomb paintings depicting craft. They're wood. So how are you going to put a 2 ton, at least 2 ton plus block onto a boat? You put a ramp over here and you put the block on the ramp, then the boat goes, got a problem. Can you get the boat, you block off the Nile and let the boat settle in the mud, and then you take the ramp over and you put the block onto the boat, and then if the Nile come back in, float it back up. Aren't you going to get stuck in the mud and never get it out? We don't even know how they literally loaded these things onto the boats. But you get them on the boat, you take it down the Nile, down is that direction, remember, take it down the Nile, and then you got to move the stones from the boats to the structure. And once you get it there, how on earth, of course, let me mention this. To unload the stone off the boat is at least as challenging, if not just as challenging, as putting it on the boat in the first place. So then you're going to have to move this to the structure. And then as the structure goes up, remember, this is 481 feet high. And it's the higher you get, the more challenge you're going to have. So how did you build the pyramids? Quite frankly, we don't know. There are a number of theories. Notice the angle. You're pulling that up. One of these, and here's the one that I actually wanted to show you. The idea is that you have the structure itself, and you've got to have the external ability to do this. So you're actually going around this a little bit like a snake. You're going to take that up to the top. No, you're not. What is the angle of this? I don't care. You can be some pretty macho guys. But are you going, I don't know the angle there. That's a pretty steep angle. With just human strength, raw human strength, you're going to move the blocks up that thing? Oh, I don't think you are. And what are you pulling it across there? What's that? If it's dirt, it's going to fall down. What's holding that up? The only thing you have is like rollers from trees. You can't use palm trees. That's about the only thing that grows in Egypt. You can't use palm trees because the wood is not thick enough. You have to get, where are you going to go for the wood? Europe? Up the Nile, way up to Africa? You're going to go to the cedars of Lebanon, hundreds of miles away? You have to get them from someplace. And then at that, they're going to push into this soil. They don't have concrete. You can't make this really heavy, really thick. What you can do, however, is just put stones. This makes no sense at all. I'm sorry, I can't buy into this. The only, can I get down here a little bit? I know that you're supposing various things. Look at the angle on that. You're not going to use human beings to pull that up. I'm sorry, it can't be done. My personal idea is this. I'm not alone, that in reality, they had to use ramps, not something that went around the edge of the structure. Yeah, like I say, this makes no sense to me. I cannot believe this is possible. I don't believe it's possible here. This makes more sense to me as this kind of a ramp. Something goes way, way, way out. So the angle is not nearly as steep as something like that. So you can keep on pulling. You'd have to maintain these somehow, keep stones going. And however, if you have something like this, you have actually more material eventually in the actual ramp going up than is actually in the structure itself. Now, this is not stone, it can be gravel or whatever you're using, but it cannot be compressible. There are no ancient Egyptian documents that have been found describing how they built pyramids, though we have tomb paintings, representations of people doing various things in their lives, and boats and hunting ducks, whatever you do in your life. There are no depictions of people building pyramids. Almost everything we have, almost every theory we have, there's a problem with it. There are some people who have gone so far as to say that pyramids were built by Martians, because there are structures, I shouldn't call them structures, there's hills on Mars. They kind of look like this, therefore they were building pyramids up there. So the Martians came down and did it with extremely advanced technology. I remember I had a conversation with a colleague a number of years ago now, and he was saying, well, it's done by the Martians. And I said, well, how? And he said, levitation. So, put your hands on them and lift up the stones that way. You have to be very careful and talk to people like this. I didn't know if I was supposed to laugh or be impressed. Very likely I did not laugh because he was serious. Okay, when you have conversations like that, you do have a tendency to say, well, I'm kind of busy, and I appreciate your arguments, we can go on. Now, the reason why you can have people with those kind of theories is that, what are your theories? I honestly believe if they did not exist, that there'd be people come by and say, I can't believe it existed, because we don't know how on earth they could have built these things. You say impressive, to say the least, no doubt about that at all. Let's say that Herodotus was told was incorrect, that it didn't take 20 years, it took 40 years. It can't be centuries and centuries because Pharaoh's going to die. 40 years, 24-hour days. Can you work all night long? It's pitch black, the sun goes down. How do you work? You can have the midnight shift, but without adequate light, that's going to be very challenging. If it is possible, then you'd have to have a completed block placed into position on the average of 8.4 minutes per block for a period of 40 years without a break. If you only use 12-hour days, actually when the sun's up, then you have to have a completed block over 2 tons, remember, moved in every 4.2 minutes. What if Herodotus was told was correct? And it's 20 years, not 40 years. Then you got another problem. 12-hour day, you have to have a completed block. Remember, about 2.5 million blocks. 2.1 minutes. I mean, come on. It just boggles the imagination how on earth they did these kinds of things. Extremely impressive. I think I'm running low on time. I am running low on time. Oh, it's just getting good. It always happens. I want to get to the next point. Let me come back. We will talk about Egypt later. Then my next point of discussion will be the use of mummies, mummification in ancient Egypt. Talked a little bit about their civilization, their ethics, when we discussed the books of the dead. In the meantime, I appreciate the fact that you will forgive me when I make mistakes. Appreciate the fact that you are still watching. And we will speak to you again next time. Whatever you're doing, please enjoy it. Goodbye.